Chapter 17. Family Management. Dark clouds loomed over the Brocket estate as Mr. Edmund Montague's carriage rattled up the drive, the wheels crunching against loose gravel. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "He's here!" Mrs. Brocket announced, her voice piercing through the drawing room. "Isabella, do stop slouching. Marianne, whatever are you doing with that candlestick? Catherine, cease your incessant scribbling this instant." Isabella rolled her eyes and adjusted her posture with deliberate slowness. Marianne continued to examine the candlestick with intense fascination. "I wonder if candles remember being trees," she mused. "Mabel!" Mrs. Brocket's voice crescendoed. "Where is that useless girl? Mabel!" "I'm right here, ain't I?" Mabel materialized from behind a curtain where she had apparently been lurking. "No need to be hollerin' the house down." "The dining room requires immediate attention. And do something about your hair. You look like you've been dragged through a bramble patch." "Funny that, seeing as you had me trimming them brambles earlier," Mabel muttered, shuffling towards the dining room. Mr. Brocket lowered his book slightly. "I trust we're not subjecting the poor fellow to one of your experimental recipes, my dear." "I have instructed Mabel to prepare her signature dish." "Mabel has a signature dish?" Mr. Brocket's eyebrows rose incrementally. "She will by dinner time," Mrs. Brocket declared with unwavering certainty. The doorbell rang, its discordant chime echoing through the house. Mrs. Brocket swept towards the entrance, pausing only to hiss at her daughters. "Remember, we must appear utterly sophisticated and intellectually stimulated." Mr. Edmund Montague stood in the doorway, a tall, thin man with features that suggested a perpetual state of mild surprise. Rain had begun to fall, dotting his coat with dark spots. "Mr. Montague, how delightfully propitious of you to join us!" Mrs. Brocket beamed, mangling the word's meaning entirely. Isabella suppressed a smirk, while Mr. Brocket developed a sudden, intense interest in the ceiling's woodwork. "Charmed, I'm sure," Mr. Montague replied, his eyes darting between the sisters as Mrs. Brocket made the introductions. Thunder crashed overhead as they moved to the drawing room. The storm was drawing closer. "I do hope the weather improves," Mr. Montague said, settling into a chair that released a suspicious cloud of dust. "I should hate to impose—" "Nonsense!" Mrs. Brocket interrupted. "We would be most distressed if you attempted to journey home in such conditions. We have plenty of room, don't we, Mabel?" Mabel, who had appeared with a tray of questionable-looking refreshments, grimaced. "If you say so, ma'am. Though the west wing's got that leak, and the east wing's got them rats, and the south wing's got that peculiar smell what no one can explain." "That will do, Mabel," Mrs. Brocket cut in sharply. "Do attend to dinner." "Righto, but I should tell you, the kitchen chimney's belching smoke like nobody's business. Dinner, Mabel." As Mabel shuffled away, the sisters exchanged meaningful glances. Catherine began fidgeting with her journal, while Isabella drummed her fingers against her armrest in an increasingly aggressive pattern. "Tell me, Mr. Montague," Mrs. Brocket leaned forward, "what are your views on the modern woman's education?" "Well, Fascinating. I myself have always maintained that a woman's mind should be properly cultivated, like a well-maintained garden. Though, of course, not too well-maintained, lest it become overrun with dangerous ideas. Isabella, do share your thoughts on the matter." Isabella's eyes sharpened like daggers. "I believe women's minds are rather like wildfire, Mother. Impossible to contain once properly ignited." Mrs. Brocket's smile tightened. How whimsical. Marianne, I once saw a garden gnome that looked exactly like our butcher, Marianne offered dreamily. I've often wondered if he leads a secret double life. Mr. Montague's expression of mild surprise deepened considerably. A crash from the kitchen interrupted any further discussion of garden gnomes or women's education. Mabel's voice carried through the house. "Don't no one panic! The fire's mostly sorted." "Dinner is served," Mrs. Brockett announced hastily, rising with forced grace. The dining room presented a tableau of barely contained chaos. Candles flickered ominously, casting strange shadows on the walls. The table settings were arranged with what appeared to be a creative interpretation of proper placement. "I believe this spoon might be upside down," Mr. Montague observed quietly. "It's the latest fashion in London," Mrs. Brockett declared. "One must be adventurous with one's cutlery arrangements." Mabel appeared with the first course, a soup of indeterminate origin and questionable consistency. "It's supposed to look like that," she announced unprompted. "Probably." The storm outside intensified, rain lashing against the windows. Catherine kept glancing at the grandfather clock, while Isabella maintained a running commentary on the various ways one might die from food poisoning. "I find your daughter's knowledge of poisons quite extensive," Mr. Montague commented between careful sips of soup. "Oh, yes, Isabella is terribly accomplished," Mrs. Brockett smiled tightly. "Though perhaps we could discuss more appropriate dinner topics, dear?" "Did you know," Marianne piped up, "that if you listen carefully to soup, sometimes it whispers secrets? This one's being rather rude, actually." Lightning flashed, illuminating the dining room in stark white light. Thunder followed immediately, causing the windows to rattle in their frames. "Goodness," Mr. Montague jumped slightly. "It appears I really must impose upon your hospitality tonight." "How unfortunate," Isabella murmured, then added more loudly, "How fortunate." The main course arrived in a cloud of suspicious smoke. Mabel placed it on the table with the air of someone disposing of evidence. "It's lamb," she announced. "Probably." As the evening wore on, the sisters grew increasingly restless. Catherine's eyes barely left the clock, while Isabella's attempts to hurry the meal along became less and less subtle. "I believe we're all quite exhausted," she announced as Mabel cleared the last plates. "We should retire immediately." "Nonsense," Mrs. Brockett countered. "Mr. Montague hasn't yet told us about his views on proper church attendance." "Actually, I am rather tired," Mr. Montague admitted, stifling a yawn. "Then it's settled." Catherine practically leapt from her chair. "Mabel can show you to your room." "If I must," Mabel sighed. "Mind the rat up there, though I ain't seen it lately." "Mabel!" Mrs. Brockett shot Mabel a pointed glare. "I can assure you, Mr. Montague, that there is no such nuisance. And had there been, it would have been relocated to the servants' quarters long ago." Mabel muttered under her breath, leading a slightly hesitant Mr. Montague from the room. As the household prepared for bed, the storm continued its assault on the estate. Mrs. Brockett retired to her chamber, quietly hopeful that she had made progress in her matchmaking endeavours that evening. An hour or so passed, and the grandfather clock's midnight chime reverberated through the darkened house. 3 figures crept down the main staircase, their shadows dancing in the candlelight. "Careful with those candles," Isabella whispered. The last thing we need is to burn the house down before we've even started. Though that would be rather spectacular, Marianne mused. Do you suppose ghosts can catch fire? Shh. Catherine clutched her journal to her chest. I found the perfect spot in the drawing room. There's a section in this book about creating a proper circle. A floorboard creaked behind them. The sisters whirled around to find Mabel materializing from the darkness like an unwanted conscience. I wouldn't if I was you, she warned, her voice unusually grave. Them what's dead don't take kindly to being disturbed. How long have you been following us? Isabella demanded. Long enough to know you're about to do something stupid. More stupid than usual, mind. Marianne tilted her head. Have you ever spoken to a ghost, Mabel? No, and I ain't about to start now. Unlike some people who clearly ain't got the sense they was born with. Catherine spread a black cloth on the drawing-room floor while Isabella arranged candles in a circle. Marianne produced a brass bell and several mysterious objects she'd collected from around the house. Is that Mother's best silver letter opener? Isabella asked. She probably won't miss it. Most of her letters are just practices of her signature with little crown drawings around it. Mabel hovered in the doorway, shifting from foot to foot. This is a bad idea. Worse than the time you tried to teach that badger to dance. That was entirely Marianne's fault, Isabella said. And besides, this is different. We're simply attempting to contact our dear departed ancestor, Augustus Brocket. The one who died in mysterious circumstances after accusing half the county of witchcraft, Catherine asked, consulting her journal. Precisely, though Mother always says he merely had strong opinions about proper society. Your mother says a lot of things, Mabel muttered. Most of 'em nonsense. Thunder rolled overhead as Catherine began drawing symbols on the floor with chalk. Marianne arranged various objects around the circle. A pocket watch, a dried rose, and what appeared to be a mouldy piece of bread. That's for if the ghost gets hungry, she explained seriously. Ghosts don't eat bread, Isabella sighed. How do you know? Have you ever asked one? Mabel took a reluctant step into the room. If you're determined to do this foolishness, I suppose someone with sense ought to be here? Does that mean you're joining us? Catherine asked hopefully. I ain't joining nothing. Just watching, like any sensible maid would when her mistresses are about to summon the dead. The sisters settled around the circle, leaving a space that Mabel eventually filled, muttering about addle-brained girls and asking for trouble. Catherine opened her journal to a marked page. We're supposed to join hands and focus our thoughts on the spirit we wish to contact. And then what? Isabella asked. Then something's supposed to happen. Brilliant planning! They joined hands, the candlelight casting strange shadows on their faces. Catherine began to read from her journal, her voice trembling slightly. Spirit of Augustus Brocket, we seek your presence. Tell him we've got bread, Marianne whispered. Shut up, Marianne, Isabella hissed. Spirit of Augustus Brocket, Catherine continued. We call upon you to manifest. The candles flickered. A cold draught swept through the room despite the closed windows. That's just the wind, Mabel said quick. What with this house being full of holes, like Mrs. Brocket's logic. The temperature dropped further. The brass bell began to ring of its own accord, a hollow, eerie sound that made them all jump. Perhaps we should stop, Catherine suggested, her voice small. We can't stop now, Isabella insisted. We've barely begun. A voice cut through the darkness, unlike any they had ever heard. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filled with decades of disapproval. Who dares disturb my rest? Marianne brightened. Would you like some bread? The voice paused, momentarily thrown off. Then it returned, somehow even more thunderous. Silence! Impudent child! A figure began to materialize in the center of the circle. At first it was merely a suggestion of shape, but it gradually solidified into the form of a tall, severe-looking man in Georgian dress. His face was gaunt, his eyes burning with an otherworldly light. Augustus Brocket, Isabella breathed. Indeed. The spirit fixed them with a penetrating stare. And what manner of degeneracy is this? Young ladies conducting forbidden rituals in the dead of night? We just thought it might be interesting to chat, Catherine offered weakly. Chat? The ghost's form flickered with indignation. In my day, young ladies occupied themselves with proper pursuits, not consorting with spirits. In your day, you accused the baker's wife of turning people into toads, Isabella pointed out. She was highly suspicious. Mabel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally found her voice. Right then, you've had your fun. Time to send him back where he came from. How exactly do we do that? Catherine whispered, frantically flipping through her journal. You did read the whole book, didn't you? Isabella demanded. I may have skipped a few pages. The binding was quite stiff. The ghost of Augustus Brocket loomed larger, his form becoming more solid with each passing moment. Objects around the room began to rattle. Such disrespect! Such impropriety! This house has fallen into shocking disorder. That's rich, coming from someone who's been dead for decades, Isabella muttered. Would you like to sit down? Marianne offered. We could have a proper tea party, though I suppose the tea would go right through you. Enough! Augustus roared. The windows shook in their frames. You shall all learn the price of meddling with forces beyond your understanding. A book flew off a shelf, narrowly missing Catherine's head. The candles flared unnaturally high, then extinguished themselves, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the ghost's ethereal glow. I told you this was a bad idea, Mabel said. But does anyone ever listen to Mabel? No, they never. The ghost began to laugh, a horrible sound that seemed to echo through time itself. The furniture started to move of its own accord, scraping across the floor. We should probably run, Isabella suggested. There is no escape. From upstairs came the sound of movement, footsteps, doors opening. Oh, Lord! Catherine whimpered. Mother's awake! That's done it, Mabel announced. Ghost or no ghost, we're all for it now. Augustus Brocket's spirit swelled with malevolent glee, filling the room with an otherworldly chill. As Mrs. Brocket's voice rang out from above, demanding to know what was happening, the ghost's laughter reached a crescendo. Let the entertainment begin! The sisters huddled together as heavy footsteps descended the stairs. They couldn't decide which was more terrifying, the vengeful spirit of their ancestor or their mother's imminent arrival at 1:30 in the morning. Mrs. Brocket burst into the drawing-room in her nightgown, her face contorted with fury. What is the meaning of this nocturnal... She stopped dead at the sight of Augustus Brocket's spectral form hovering above her daughters. Ah, the lady of the house! Augustus boomed. How disappointing! Mrs. Brocket opened and closed her mouth several times before finding her voice. "I beg your pardon?" "Now you've done it," Mabel muttered to the ghost. "Nobody disappoints Mrs. Brocket. She does all the disappointing round here." Mr. Brocket appeared in the doorway, followed closely by a trembling Mr. Montague. "Good Lord," Mr. Brocket said mildly, "I suppose this explains the noise, though I was rather hoping it was just Mabel dropping things again." "I never!" Mabel protested. "Silence!" Augustus commanded. A vase shot across the room and shattered against the wall. "That was my favourite vase!" Mrs. Brocket shrieked, momentarily forgetting her terror in favour of outrage. "Was it?" Isabella asked. "You've never mentioned it before." "It is now, and you've let this spectral vandal destroy it." Mr. Montague pressed himself against the wall, his eyes wide. "I don't suppose this is some sort of elaborate entertainment arranged for guests?" "Foolish mortal!" Augustus turned his burning gaze on the unfortunate suitor. "Your presence here is as unwelcome as a plague rat at a banquet." "How dare you!" Mrs. Brocket found her second wind. "Mr. Montague is a guest of distinction." "Was a guest of distinction," Mr. Montague corrected, edging towards the door. "I really think I should—" The doors slammed shut of their own accord. Augustus's laughter filled the room as chairs began to dance across the floor in a macabre waltz. "Knew this'd happen," Mabel said. "But does anyone listen to the maid? Nah. They just expect me to clean up after, ghost or no ghost." "This house has fallen into ruin," Augustus declared. "Look at this wallpaper, these furnishings, and the company you keep." "I object to that last part." Mrs. Brocket drew herself up. "We maintain the highest standards of social—" A portrait flew off the wall, nearly taking her head with it. "Mother," Catherine ventured timidly, "perhaps now isn't the best time to argue about social standards." "There is always time for social standards," Mrs. Brocket insisted, even as she ducked to avoid a flying candlestick. Marianne watched the chaos with fascination. "Do you suppose he's angry because he's hungry? The bread's still here, though it might be a bit squashed now." "Enough of your prattle!" Augustus roared. The temperature dropped so low, their breath became visible in the air. "Witness the consequences of your impudence!" The furniture began to spin in the air, forming a whirlwind of domestic debris. Books flew from their shelves, pages fluttering like demented birds. The curtains writhed like living things. Mr. Montague let out a most ungentlemanly shriek as his wig was plucked from his head by invisible hands and added to the maelstrom. "My word," Mr. Brocket observed. "He's even more dramatic than you, my dear." Mrs. Brocket was too busy dodging airborne ornaments to respond. "I don't suppose," Isabella called over the supernatural cacophony, "that anyone thought to bring something to get rid of angry ghosts." "There might have been something about that in the later chapters," Catherine admitted, clutching her now useless journal. "The ones you didn't read? They were very dusty pages." Augustus's form grew larger, his spectral light casting twisted shadows on the walls. "Your punishment is just beginning." The ghost raised his arms, and every piece of furniture in the room rose into the air. Mr. Montague fainted dead away, crumpling to the floor with remarkable timing as a heavy armchair sailed through the space where his head had been. "Now see here," Mrs. Brocket attempted to assert control, despite her visible trembling. "This is completely improper. I simply cannot have ancestral spirits terrorizing my household in the middle of the night. What will the town think?" "They will think nothing," Augustus declared, "for they shall never hear of it. None shall leave this room." "That seems a bit extreme," Mr. Brocket commented. "The house is rather draughty as it is, without adding ghostly imprisonment to its features." Mabel crossed her arms. "I ain't being trapped in here. I've got duties to attend to. Eventually. When I get round to them." "Silence, impudent servant! Oh, that's rich! You've been dead for decades, and you're still going on about social class?" The ghost's response was to make every window in the room explode inward, sending shards of glass flying in all directions. The sisters screamed and ducked behind an overturned table. "Mother's going to blame us for this," Catherine whimpered. "Mother's going to blame us for everything," Isabella corrected, "assuming we survive." "I once had a dream about flying furniture," Marianne mused, watching a footstool orbit the room. Though in the dream the furniture was much friendlier, and there was a talking teapot who gave excellent advice about hat choices. Augustus turned his attention to the paintings, making them spin on the walls like deranged carousels. "Behold my power, tremble before—" "You're getting paint chips all over my carpet," Mrs. Brocket interrupted. "That is rather the point." "Well, it's exceedingly inconsiderate." Mr. Montague chose this moment to regain consciousness, took one look at the scene before him, and promptly fainted again. "There goes another potential suitor," Mrs. Brocket lamented, ducking as a tea tray whizzed past her head. "Do you girls have any idea how difficult it is to find eligible gentlemen in Lesser Mudbury?" "This is no time for matrimonial concerns," Augustus thundered. "Your house is mine to torment." The ghost's form began to pulse with an eerie light, and a wind that shouldn't have been possible indoors whipped through the room. Book pages turned by themselves, curtains billowed, and the very foundations of the house seemed to groan. "I don't suppose," Mr. Brocket said carefully, "that anyone knows how to exorcise a ghost." "Don't be ridiculous, Henry," Mrs. Brocket snapped. "Exorcisms are terribly middle class." "Better middle class than dead," Isabella muttered. Augustus let out another bone-chilling laugh as the furniture continued its aerial ballet of destruction. "Your mortal methods cannot banish me. I shall remain here, teaching you the error of your ways, until—" "Until what?" Marianne asked brightly. "Do you have other haunting appointments to keep?" The ghost actually paused, thrown off balance by the question. Then, with renewed fury, "Insolent child, I shall show you the true meaning of terror." The room plunged into darkness, broken only by Augustus's ghostly glow and occasional flashes of lightning from the storm outside. Strange shadows danced on the walls, taking forms that shouldn't have been possible. The temperature dropped even further, frost forming on the windows that still had glass in them. Mrs. Brocket, despite her terror, managed to maintain her priorities. "This is absolutely ruining my chances of marrying any of you off to advantage." "Enough!" Augustus roared one final time. "Let the real haunting begin!" As the ghost's power reached new heights and the chaos intensified, Mabel's voice cut through the supernatural din. "I don't suppose anyone's got any better ideas. Only I'd rather not spend the rest of my life in a possessed drawing room. The dusting would be murder." Mrs. Brocket's patience, like her prized vase, had shattered. After an hour of ghostly torment, she'd reached her limit. "This has gone quite far enough," she declared, dodging a vindictive footstool. "I refuse to be terrorized in my own drawing room by a relative who couldn't even die properly." "What?" Augustus's form flickered with indignation. "Mother," Isabella warned, "perhaps antagonizing the vengeful spirit isn't the wisest." "Nonsense! If anyone's going to create chaos in this household, it shall be me." Mrs. Brockett turned to her husband. "Henry, fetch my copy of Domestic Tranquility and Spiritual Harmony." "The one you use to prop up the wobbly table?" Mr. Brockett asked. "No, the one I use to swat flies. Of course the table one. Mabel, make yourself useful and find some candles that aren't floating about the ceiling." "Right," Mabel sighed, "because that's exactly what I wanted to do today. Chase after flying candles while a ghost throws a tantrum." "I am not throwing a tantrum." "Could have fooled me," Mabel muttered, ducking under a suspended chair. Mr. Montague, who had wedged himself behind a bookcase, ventured a question. "Shouldn't we perhaps contact a professional?" "Don't be absurd," Mrs. Brockett snapped. "I refuse to let it be known that we required outside assistance for a family matter. Mabel, those candles won't catch themselves." "Neither will that tea tray what's about to hit you in the head, Ma'am." Mrs. Brockett ducked just in time. "This is precisely why we can't have nice things." "Enough of this foolishness," Augustus boomed. "You cannot banish me with a book of household management." "Watch me," Mrs. Brockett said grimly. "Henry, where is that book?" Mr. Brockett carefully made his way across the chaos-strewn room, narrowly avoiding several pieces of airborne furniture. "Here, my dear, though I feel compelled to point out that this may not be the most orthodox approach to exorcism." "When have I ever cared for orthodox approaches? Now, everyone gather round. Mabel, stop cowering and form a circle with us." "I ain't cowering," Mabel protested. "I'm strategically avoiding death by flying furniture." The family reluctantly formed a circle, joined by a still trembling Mr. Montague, who seemed unable to find the exit. "Now then," Mrs. Brockett opened the book with a flourish. "Chapter 7. On the Proper Management of Domestic Disturbances." "I don't think they meant this kind of disturbance," Catherine whispered. "Your pathetic attempts at banishment amuse me," Augustus declared, making the chandelier swing ominously. Mrs. Brockett began to read. "The well-ordered household must maintain harmony through strict adherence to proper principles." "Is this really the time for a lecture on household management?" Isabella interrupted. "Silence! All elements which disturb the natural order must be addressed with firmness and dignity." Wah! "You dare to lecture me on order?" Augustus's voice shook the windows. "I who maintained the strictest standards of propriety in life." "Oh, please." Mrs. Brockett looked up from her book. "You accused the milliner of consorting with demons because she suggested yellow ribbons were fashionable." "Yellow is the devil's colour." "Yellow is the colour of daffodils," Marianne contributed helpfully. "Though I suppose if daffodils were evil, they'd be very cheerful about it." The ghost's form pulsed with rage, sending another wave of objects flying around the room. "This doesn't seem to be working," Mr. Brockett observed mildly. "That's because you're all doing it wrong," Mrs. Brockett snapped. "Put more feeling into it. Mabel, stop slouching." "I ain't slouching. I'm avoiding that possessed umbrella what's trying to impale me," Excuses, excuses. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. The mistress of the house must maintain absolute authority. Mother, Isabella interjected, I don't think reading about household management is going to— Silence! Both Mrs. Brockett and Augustus shouted simultaneously. They glared at each other, mortal and spirit locked in a battle of wills. Now see here, Mrs. Brockett addressed the ghost directly. This is my house, and I will not have some centuries-dead relative causing disorder in my drawing room. Your house? Augustus grew larger, his spectral light intensifying. This house has belonged to the Brockett line for generations. Yes, and I married into it, which means I'm stuck with all of its peculiarities, including apparently its ghostly residents. But I draw the line at supernatural tantrums. The ghost's response was to make every piece of furniture in the room rise to the ceiling. I think you're making him angry, Mr. Montague whimpered. Making him angry? Mabel scoffed. This is just Tuesday for Mrs. Brockett. Mrs. Brockett brandished her book like a weapon. Everyone join hands again. We shall try Chapter 12. On the removal of unwanted elements from the household. I don't think this is what the author had in mind, Mr. Brockett commented. The author clearly never met my mother, Isabella muttered. They joined hands, forming a circle beneath the floating furniture. Mrs. Brockett began to read again, her voice rising above the supernatural chaos. All unwanted elements must be addressed with firmness and dignity. Stand straight, speak clearly, and maintain eye contact. With what? Augustus thundered. My ethereal form? Don't interrupt. Assert your authority through clear, decisive action. What? The ghost's laughter shook the foundations of the house. Your mortal authority means nothing to me. Well, your immortal authority means nothing to me. Henry, you're not concentrating. My apologies, dear. I was rather distracted by the armchair attempting to knock me senseless. Excuses. Catherine, stop trembling. Isabella, that's not a proper exorcism posture. Marianne, what are you doing? I'm trying to remember if I've ever seen a ghost yawn, Marianne replied thoughtfully. Do they need to sleep? Or perhaps they're always sleeping, and that's why they're see-through. Augustus paused in his furniture hurling to stare at her in bewilderment. Focus, Mrs. Brockett commanded. Now, all together, I hereby assert my authority over this household and all its contents. They repeated the words, their voices a discordant chorus. The ghost responded by making the furniture spin faster. This really isn't working, Isabella observed as a writing desk whizzed past her head. That's because you're not trying hard enough. Again. Ma'am, Mabel interrupted. I don't mean to question your methods, or do I? But for heaven's sake, try something else before we all end up as ghostly as him. Nonsense! We simply need more conviction. Chapter 15. On the maintenance of order in times of crisis. Enough! Augustus roared. The book was suddenly ripped from Mrs. Brockett's hands and added to the orbital debris. Now look what you've done! Mrs. Brockett rounded on her family. This is exactly why we can't have nice exorcisms. The ghost's power reached new heights. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with supernatural energy. Frost crept across every surface, and the very air felt charged with malevolent force. I don't suppose, Mr. Brockett ventured, that anyone has a backup plan. Your mortal plans are meaningless, Augustus declared. Prepare to face the full extent of my power. As the ghost launched into what promised to be an even more dramatic display of supernatural fury, Mrs. Brocket's eyes flashed with warning. "Very well," she said, her voice taking on a familiar tone that made her family wince. "If you insist on being difficult about this, I suppose I'll have to resort to more personal measures." "Mother," Isabella warned, "what are you planning?" Mrs. Brocket's smile would have made a basilisk proud. "I believe it's time we had a proper family discussion about certain historical matters." For the first time since his appearance, Augustus's ghostly form flickered with something that looked suspiciously like uncertainty. "Now then, Augustus," Mrs. Brocket's voice cut through the supernatural chaos like a knife through butter, "shall we discuss the incident with Lady Rutherford's prize-winning petunias in 1783? The ghost's form flickered violently. "You wouldn't dare!" "Oh, but I would. I've read all the family papers, you see. Every last one. Including those rather interesting letters hidden behind the loose brick in the library." The floating furniture began to wobble in its orbit. "Mother," Isabella whispered, "what are you doing?" "What I do best, dear, exploiting family secrets for maximum effect." Augustus's spectral light dimmed slightly. "Those letters were meant to remain private." "As private as your relationship with Lady Rutherford's gardener." The ghost let out an otherworldly shriek. Several pieces of furniture dropped from their aerial positions. "Fascinating," Mr. Brocket murmured. "I always wondered why that section of the garden refused to grow petunias." "And then there's the matter of your sister's dowry," Mrs. Brocket continued relentlessly. "Such an unfortunate accident with those accounting books, wasn't it?" "Silence! Make me— Or shall we discuss your creative interpretation of your father's will?" Mr. Montague, still wedged behind what remained of the bookcase, found his voice. "Is this really an appropriate topic for mixed company?" "Nothing about this situation is appropriate," Isabella pointed out. "Though I must admit, Mother's talent for weaponizing scandal is almost admirable." The ghost's form was definitely shrinking now. "You have no proof of any—" "Oh, but I do." Mrs. Brocket's smile widened. "And I haven't even mentioned the incident with the bishop's wig and the duck pond." "There was a bishop?" Marianne perked up. "Was he friends with the ducks? I've always thought clergy should spend more time with waterfowl." Augustus's spectral light flickered like a candle in a draught. The remaining airborne furniture began to descend, albeit chaotically. "Face it, Augustus," Mrs. Brocket pressed her advantage. "You're not the only one who knows how to create a disturbance, though I must say, throwing furniture about is rather crude compared to a well-placed rumour at a tea party." "You wouldn't dare spread such tales." "Try me. I've been storing up family gossip for years. It's like preserving fruit, only more satisfying." The ghost's form wavered uncertainly. But I am already dead." "Yes, but your reputation isn't yet." Mrs. Brocket straightened her nightgown with dignity. "Now, shall we discuss your departure? Or would you prefer I continue? I have some particularly interesting details about your collection of French novels." "You know," Mr. Brocket commented, "I'm beginning to understand why the library was always locked on Sundays." Augustus's mighty presence had diminished to something almost pitiful. The supernatural wind died down, leaving the room in disarray, but mercifully devoid of flying furniture. This is blackmail." "No, dear Augustus, this is family management. Now, will you leave quietly, or shall I tell everyone about the real reason you started that witch hunt?" The ghost let out one final, defeated wail. His form began to fade, the malevolent light dying away. "Very well, but know this. You are a terrible influence on this family." "Thank you," Mrs. Brockett replied primly. "I do try." With a final flash and a sound like distant thunder, Augustus Brockett vanished. The temperature in the room returned to normal, though the destruction remained as evidence of his visit. Mr. Montague emerged from behind the bookcase, his wig askew. I think perhaps I should be going." "In this weather?" Mrs. Brockett turned to him with a predatory smile. "Surely you wouldn't want to risk catching your death, though I suppose we've had enough of that for one evening." "No, really, I insist." He backed towards the door. "I have an urgent appointment, in London, possibly forever." Before anyone could stop him, he fled the room. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house, followed by frantic hoofbeats as his carriage departed at speed. "Well," Mrs. Brockett surveyed the destruction, "that's another suitor gone. I hope you're all satisfied with yourselves." "Mother," Catherine ventured, "we're terribly sorry about—" "Sorry? Sorry doesn't begin to cover it. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to find eligible gentlemen who aren't afraid of ghosts?" "To be fair," Isabella pointed out, "most people are afraid of ghosts." "That's no excuse. In my day, we conducted our supernatural encounters with proper decorum." Marianne picked up her squashed piece of bread. At least the ghost didn't eat the snacks, though I suppose that means he wasn't hungry after all. "Enough!" Mrs. Brockett rounded on her daughters. "If you ever attempt something like this again, you'll wish you only had a ghost to deal with. I can make Augustus look positively amenable. Now, go to your rooms and think about what you've done." The sisters fled, still shaking from the night's events. "Mabel!" "Yes, ma'am." Mabel emerged from behind an overturned sofa. "Clean this mess up." "All of it. Now." "No, next Tuesday. Of course now." "Right." Mabel surveyed the destruction. "Don't suppose this counts as overtime." "Consider it part of your spiritual development. And do something about that chandelier. It's still spinning." As Mabel began the impossible task of restoring order, Mr. Brockett approached his wife. "My dear, I must say, your knowledge of family history is quite extensive." "A lady must have her hobbies, Henry, though I must admit Augustus made it rather easy. He always was terrible at hiding evidence." She straightened her nightcap. "Now, I must write to Lady Uppington immediately. If we can't find suitors in Lesser Mudbury, perhaps she knows of some eligible gentlemen who are hard of hearing, or preferably deaf." "At this hour?" "Matrimonial emergencies wait for no one. Mabel, fetch my writing desk, and do mind the ghost residue." As Mrs. Brockett swept from the room, already planning her next social campaign, Mabel stood amid the wreckage of the drawing-room. "Ghost residue?" she muttered, picking up a spectral singed cushion. "I don't remember that being in me job description, though better than polishing the silver." The grandfather clock, somehow still standing, struck 3 in the morning. Somewhere in the darkness, a piece of furniture creaked ominously, though whether from supernatural after-effects or just the house's usual decrepitude was anyone's guess.